bit about about Gallagher, about your organisation.
So Gallagher is the largest insurance broker in England. I think it's the third largest in the world. We're about a 14 billion revenue company, and our kind of relationship with Microlize is we are your insurance broker, and I was the guy that Nadeem and Nick called on the recent incident.
So how do you sort of assess sort of risks, cyber risks, particularly within the transport industry? How does that work?
Well, I think the thing that I'm learning about Microlize is it's largely a data business. So yes, it's in the transport industry, but the product it provides is the ability to capture and essentially aggregate data for all interested parties. So Microlize's risk is quite unique. It's not a pure play logistics company, but similar to most organizations now, everybody uses Office 365. Everybody has an ERP system, an MRP system. And, as part of the panel, we were just talking about how largely all of these technology products that businesses are used by everybody else. So most companies now are all using the same technology, which is a nightmare for insurance because it's all in one pot.
And so how do you assess that? How do you get that balance right?
If you take a healthcare incident, the threat of a cyber attack is a threat to life because you don't have the medicinal information to service this patient versus, a manufacturer. We don't have our machines available to make product. So I think the first thing is looking at the impact of a cyber attack on the industry is largely about what they do. I'd much prefer to get a call from a manufacturer than I do a healthcare company because obviously the impact is far more significant. In terms of businesses kind of almost reducing their chances of this happening to them, it's all about, no different to a healthy diet or, a fire system in a building that's well maintained and all the rest of it. It's all around proactive, removing issues that could cause issues, things like vulnerability scanning, pen testing, running simulations of attacks. You can generally tell companies that are going to have claims because they generally, don't have a whole amount of proactive work that's going on in the background.
And is it just that simple a case, or it couldn't happen to us, it couldn't happen to me? Is that?
Yeah, so really interesting. We just did a poll on the panel about how many businesses have never been impacted by a cyber attack, and the stat was 61% of that audience said they hadn't ever had an incident, which is so false because the issue is they don't know that it's happened because largely an attacker will look at, is there any value here? And if there's no value, they move on. So that stat is probably more 10% have not had a known incident. But when most of my day is spent talking to criminals and trying to negotiate ransoms down, these are industries with management information, call centers. It's a fully fledged operation where everybody at some point will be, I wouldn't say a victim, but they'll be involved in some sort of incident. It's a foregone conclusion.
So how important is it for you to be here, and in a sense, because you've got a captive audience here?
I think for me, learning more about what Microlize do, understanding the culture. I was at the dinner last night, and looking at how they are a voice in the transport industry. So, I've got a great relationship with Nadeem, and I think a part of our next evolution is maybe what more can Microlize do to help this new modern problem of cybersecurity, because there's one thing about Nadeem that's really impressive, and I learned a lot about him going through the recent stuff, is an incredibly smart man, and he knows his business inside out. It's very rare to work with a CEO who's actually built the technology that they provide. So
because he's come through the company, he's kind of grown with the company.
Well, normally, when you're working with a board of directors, a C-suite, they, try and say it politely, they are a steward of the business, whereas this is, Nadeem's kind of long journey lifeblood. The kind of stuff that we went through together, I've seen who he is as an individual and how much he cares about his business, and the knowledge that he has of his entire operation. I've never seen it. I've never seen it in another business. Again, because you don't normally get somebody that's come through the business at that level and operates and does what he does. So I think for him and Microlize, it might be now how they can help their clients deal with something they've got acute experience of.
I mean, that was one of the things I was going to say to you. It is sometimes it is just about that communication, letting people know this is how it's done. How do you sort of looking at things like what's happening in the world at the moment? We are in a pretty volatile state at the moment.
Yeah.
Does that make people more vulnerable to cyber attacks?
Without question. So all of the geopolitical issues are creating. I can't say with absolute certainty, but there's a direct link to increased cyber attacks because it's a method of war. And again, with all cyber attacks, it's very difficult to pinpoint who it was because there's no DNA in cybersecurity. You can essentially host other laptops to perform your attack. But we sit at the heart of when things are going wrong because we're paying claims, and there is a definite increase in targeted attacks since the recent geopolitical issues.
So how can because some of the companies you'll find here are quite small. How do they prepare for something like this?
So one of the things that was mentioned on stage was something called Cyber Essentials, which was actually built by the National Cybersecurity Centre. It's a framework that they can implement to their business that ticks the boxes of we no longer have these things that make us vulnerable. So again, a bit like a good diet plan, this, if you follow this, in theory, the business is healthier. They can do that. And one of the main things we spoke about was giving a cyber attack the respect it may need to just think about it and plan what would we do if this happened, irrespective of the size of the business. They should have an idea of who they're going to call and what kind of teams they have at their disposal to be able to help them out of the incident. One of the things that Nadeem said on stage is cyber insurance for them wasn't about the money. It was about getting the players on the pitch to respond when they needed them.
So what about looking forward, sort of global trends, global practices? What do you want to see?
I'm quite fortunate in my role that I do what I do globally, so I get to see how each country is either keeping up or falling behind with the latest usage of technology. And England specifically definitely is at the forefront of technology adoption. You'd think the US generally, because they are pretty good at releasing films before we get them, they would be ahead. But no, not the case in my experience. So I think naturally our culture is to test and challenge, and we operate with a bit of cynicism. I think that's healthy, especially with cybersecurity, and there's this concept called zero trust. I think going forward, everything has to be zero trust. Even a Teams call, is that who we think it is? We spoke about a safe word on the stage. Sounds far-fetched, but I do think we're heading into a digital age where it's hard to tell what's real and what's actually a replica. Gosh,
a lot to think about. Well, thank you for
problem.
talking to us today, and enjoy the rest of the event.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.